So, I've been doing some dissertation reading lately. Okay, a lot of dissertation reading. A lot. And I've been thinking, wow, I love Loki. So yeah, I've also been watching Thor Ragnarok, and I don't think it's controversial to say that this is probably the best of the Thor movies, and up there for one of the best MCU films overall. It's had rave reviews from audiences and critics alike, with broad praise for everything from characterization to colour palette. While it has its detractors on all sides too, I've yet to find anyone who straight up hated it. Indeed, it seems almost supernaturally talented at popping up between 2nd and 5th place on any ranking of MCU films by any gradient of merit. And yeah, that's a turnaround, because Thor 2 kind of bombed. So it occurred to me to ask, why does this movie seem to be so universally loved, and yet universally not quite the best? Why is this movie always the bridesmaid and never the bride? Hi, I'm Ginny Greenteeth, and here are the 3 approaches that I think explain why Thor Ragnarok is just so actually pretty great. Part 1. I have a lot of opinions on mythology, and you're going to hear them out. So, bringing it back to all that dissertation reading, have you met Thor, God of Thunder? Because if you haven't seen this movie, then no, you really have not. See, what I think a lot of reviews overlook in the choice of Taika Waititi for director is this. Unlike Kenneth Branagh, Alan Taylor, and Joss Whedon, Taika Waititi isn't from a Christian background. Specifically, Waititi is from the North Island of New Zealand. His father is a Maori heritage of Te Awatearoa, and his mother is Jewish, of Russian Jewish heritage. In Thor and Thor the Dark World, in both Avengers movies, Thor is a grandiose Shakespearean creature from a realm of prosperous wealth and meaningful black and white conflict. The comedy in these films comes from Thor's fish-out-of-water elements and from the extremeness of heroicism he displays. I think The Dark World handled this better than the other films he's been in, but overall there's an incredibly Christianized view to the gods of Asgard. This is not new. This is in fact the opposite of new. Allow me to explain. Our knowledge of the Norse gods comes not from the Vikings themselves, but from 2 surviving books from the post-Christianization era, by which point the Scandinavians had moved to an almost entirely Christian view of the world. One of these books, Snorri Edda, was written by Snorri Sturluson in the early 14th century, with an audience mostly of other poets. It was an attempt to reconcile contemporary Christian beliefs with the pagan ancestry, and to legitimize pagan and specifically Scandinavian mythology as a literary heritage rather than a form of heresy. The other text, the Poetic Edda or Elder Edda, is a collection of poems ostensibly retained and passed down orally from the pagan Vikings. Tales of heroes and gods told through poetry, and specifically oral poetry, carried down through the generations. These stories remained in the Scandinavian and especially the Icelandic culture as a preserved heritage, and in the collective Western consciousness as a kind of more obscure, edgier alternative cultural inheritance to the Greco-Roman canon of mythology. They came in and out of traction over time, and their main heydays outside of academia were J.R.R. Tolkien's influences and borrowings from their setting and cosmology, and the Marvel Comics outing which would eventually become these movies. So if all our shiny new Marvel content is based on a Christian understanding of mythology anyway, why does it matter that Taika Waititi is of Maori and Jewish heritage? I can give you 2 excellent reasons. The first one is pretty simple. A polytheistic, halachic, and religiously flexible view on godhood allows for a better, more interesting movie. Look at the structure of Thor and Thor the Dark World in contrast to the structure of Thor Ragnarok. So you can see a contrast here where the first 2 movies, for all that they have really different concepts and ideas, they play them out in a remarkably similar fashion that's just absent in Ragnarok. We start on the world where most of the action will take place for some setup. The first few scenes leap between Thor and Jane for some character development, whilst Loki gains some emotional traction. We establish that Jane does science, Thor punches things, both of them are likeable characters, and Loki has emotional resonance. Odin lectures Thor. The plot gets a jump start when our fish is flung out of water. The grandness of Asgard is played off against the mundanity of Earth for both drama and comedy. Before the action happens, Loki does something that leads to sadness, but the audience sympathises with him anyway because of his abandonment issues. Also, Jane is still smart and Thor is still good at punching stuff. Someone makes a heroic sacrifice, there's a big fight, there's emotional closure for some, if not all of the movie's character arcs, and it turns out that Loki is still pulling someone's strings. Now obviously these 2 movies aren't clones, but the loose structure is very similar, and you can even see threads of the same in Thor and Loki's elements in Avengers Assemble. So, what's so Christian about this? Kind of everything. It was probably Kenneth Branagh who started us off on this, though I don't doubt that this is the direction the studio wanted to take, and it's not at all untrue to the comics. Both of these movies position Thor and Loki as antitheses, because that's how Christian culture likes to view divine entities. Going back to that medieval Christian interpretation of Thor, we can see a lot of Christ-like tendencies. The medieval image of Christ was all-consuming good, yes, but a warrior, a hero, good on a level which our petty battles couldn't meet or emulate. This Thor is flawed, yes, as we like our heroes, but his flaws are never at the expense of his human subjects. His flaws of character, his moral flaws, are confronted when he literally sacrifices himself for humanity, and from there he becomes a true hero. Avengers Assemble even calls him a demigod somewhat nonsensically, half god, half mortal? He's above mortality, beyond reproach from humanity, an icon more than a person to us. Even amongst his own people, he is an unparalleled bastion of moral sovereignty and martial might. Thor in these films, even in his flaws and failings, is unmitigatingly above us, and that's what makes him not super compelling. Contrast another godly hero. Now, Wonder Woman is a better movie than Thor in a lot of ways, but the one that's relevant is this. The movie is willing to bring the divine down to our level and stick with it. We struggle to relate to Thor because his only human moments are in this fish-out-of-water capacity. His humanity emerges only when we are reminded of his inhumanity. We can relate to neither his flaws nor his virtues, they just don't apply to us. With Diana, for all her godly strength and divine origin, her flaws are accessible, her naivety, her bloody-mindedness, her loss of faith, and so are her virtues, her kindness, her confidence, her hope. As such, Wonder Woman is a god we can humanise, and through humanising her, emulate. Thor is a god we can only look upon, and so however many good scenes, cool plots, or awesome ideas are piled into these movies, they never resonate. In Thor Ragnarok, Taika Waititi is able to step back and view godhood as a polytheistic culture views godhood. This fifth outing for Thor is the first that doesn't feel at war with itself, tussling between cool space movie and biblical epic. Waititi presents God as a race, much as the earliest Norse poems often seem to. These people are undilutedly gods in a way that previous movies have had to shy away from, but simultaneously unabashedly people, and refreshing to anyone who found the previous entries kinda bland. A god is abstract, untouchable, and unrelatable. A god of is fascinating, alien, but real. A god is static, while a god of has potential. And that's why this moment, where we witness the explosion of Thor into a true avatar of thunder, is so powerful in comparison to his sacrifice and rebirth in Thor. We as an audience have seen self-sacrifice time and time again in our cultural icons, we've lauded it all our lives. We value rebirth stories, but the story of reclamation, of revitalization, this is new. And that's a good thing. So what's this other thing that makes a non-Christian viewpoint so important to making a good Thor movie? Well, part 2. Hi, my name is Ginny, and I am a problematic Loki apologist. You remember how I said earlier how I had been thinking about Loki a lot? Yeah, I've been thinking about Loki a lot. The main reason for this is all the dissertation reading. If you're a big fan of Thor Ragnarok, you really should give the Poetic Edda a go. In Lokasena, Loki basically gatecrashes a party of the gods so he can shit-talk everyone for not inviting him in the form of a slut-shaming rap battle. In Thrimskviva, the one you probably read about in the notes of a really dodgy fanfic a while ago, or one of like 3 good fanfics that mention it, Thor beats up a bunch of giants whilst wearing a wedding dress. If you like more conventionally mythology texts, check out Snorri Edda, which is also known as the Prose Edda. Essentially, this is a continuation of my previous point, but the Loki of the Eddas is a character I find fascinating. Half Jotun, half Aesir, he's an ally to the gods and yet always on the periphery, blood brother to Odin, and yet inevitable agent of Ragnarok. A pattern I've seen discussed elsewhere is how Loki is viewed differently in sources we know or suspect to come from exclusively Christian authors. The position of precarious balance, of tricksiness that is valuable and yet ever on the precipice of doing irrevocable damage without any real malicious intent, is something that Christian authors seem to really struggle with, both at the time and in the modern day. Because most of us have grown up in a culture where Christianity is dominant, and all of us have grown up in a culture where Christianity is visible, we often don't really realise how evil is a concept that Christianity interacts with very differently to pretty much every other religion I can call to mind. There's a reason we say sympathy for the devil. Since long, long before Milton, Christian literature has had a tendency to present the devil as by far the most interesting character in all of biblical canon. And yes, I am about to justify comparing Thor to Paradise Lost. This might come as a shock to you, but Loki from the MCU is really popular. No, really. See, in the first 3 movies where he appeared, Loki was kind of both the best and worst thing about the movie. The movie is about Thor, but the pathos, the emotion, the soul was always carried by Hiddleston's Loki. The acting helps here, but it isn't because Hiddleston is particularly a better actor than any of the other cast members. True, he's more of a character actor than Hemsworth, who seems to shine most prominently in the role of guy putting way too much into this genre flick and nailing it. But really, it's all in the writing. Thor's arc in the first movie is pretty good. It's a classic becoming a hero narrative. He starts a bold, brash warrior whose arrogance gets him in trouble. He's stripped of his powers and banished to Earth, where he falls in love. He's humbled by defeat. He learns the value of sacrifice. Through this, he earns back his divine power and returns home to face his brother, saves the Jotnar he nearly annihilated himself earlier to show he's come full circle, and then defeats and loses his brother. Loki's arc is more abstract. He lives in the shadow of his golden brother, stages a disaster at his coronation. We're primed to sympathise with this first action because we see him immediately as the underdog, which we as a consumer culture love. He tries to stop them going to Jotunheim, but they go anyway. There his brother showboats, and Loki discovers that he's his own people's historic enemy, the monster under the bed that his own brother swore to eradicate as a child. He tests it, and when struck with inescapable evidence, confronts his father, who collapses into a magic coma before he can make explanations. He lies to his brother to trap him on Earth, and tries to eradicate his birth species, starting by murdering his bio-dad in the name of his adoptive father. When his brother looks to return, he sends the Destroyer to kill him, but Thor manages to thwart his destruction of Jotunheim. His father wakes up, and when they don't accept him back, Loki chooses to fall into the void of space. So yeah, Loki is just fundamentally more interesting than Thor in these earlier movies, to the extent that when he was just kinda there being evil in the Avengers, fans assumed he must be mind-controlled. These authors and directors, used to a canon of sympathetic devils, don't really know how to make Thor a god and an interesting character without sacrificing one for the other. What they do know is how to make a fall from grace and emotionally compelling narrative. In Thor Ragnarok, Loki's enjoyability as a character doesn't come at the expense of the rest of the entire movie. It's that simple. The Loki of Thor Ragnarok benefits massively from not having the entire weight of making this film emotionally engaging on his shoulders, because honestly, I do not think we were in desperate need of yet another Thor movie about basically the exact same conflict. Don't get me wrong, plenty of people wanted that movie, I just am not one of them. So, no longer the crux of the pathos of the entire Thor franchise, what does Loki become? Ah yes, the petty, melodramatic, manipulative twink he was destined to be. Always knew you had it in you, kid. So, in the mythology, or at least in the parlance of mythology nerds, Loki is a wild guy. In some stories, he's a kind of benign agent of chaos, either doing whatever comes to mind on wild impulse, like hitting an annoying magic eagle with a stick and getting kidnapped, or helping out the gods by having the ideas nobody else has, like turning into a horse and getting pregnant to stop a giant building a wall. He's a kind of societal abstract, changeable of gender, of sexuality, of role, of morality, even of shape. He's the kind of trickster figure that post-Christian authors tend to transpose into the image of Lucifer, manipulatively and seductively dangerous. In Ragnarok, though, Loki is perhaps the most visible and dramatic change from previous canon. After a brief stint of inexplicable fascism in the Avengers, in the Dark World we left him on the throne of Asgard, smirking nefariously, implied to have committed some unspeakable treachery against Odin. In Thor Ragnarok, we return to find him living la vida loca, with Odin just shipped off to a retirement home on Earth. Loki lounges about Asgard, watching plays about his own heroics and keeping Thor out of his hair. He and Thor tussle like siblings throughout in a way that's literally only happened once in the entire time they've been in films together. They mock each other's fashion sense and life choices with the dynamism of a family for whom the entire MCU took place over the equivalent of like a month at most. And stabbing each other is the kind of minor nuisance that would get brought up at every family argument, and come on Thor, that was ages ago, get over it. It feels like the Loki in Ragnarok is no longer a magnificently evil chess master, but an opportunistic charmer with a knack for finding himself in trouble and a gift for talking himself out of it. I could totally picture this guy talking Thor into pretending to be a bride to get the drop on an enemy, or bickering with Spider-Man about New York hot dogs. And speaking as a lover of myths and a lover of comics and a lover of smooth-talking trickster characters, that's my guy. And that's how Loki is able to redeem himself, not through a trite sacrifice, not through audience sympathy outweighing his on-screen acts of villainy, but through recognising and understanding the potential of a character. The Loki of Ragnarok is still the same person from previous movies. He still suffered these emotional blows, made these choices, still vacillated somewhat annoyingly between, oh, so he's evil, wait, no, he wants to be good, wait, no, it was an act, oh, he's dead, wait, no, evil, hang on, what? In Ragnarok, this shaky writing is canonised as a characterisation in and of itself. Loki is variable. He does whatever seems most in line with his current goals at any given time, self-interested but not exclusively so. His motivations and intent change from moment to moment. And so for me, for all that he takes at emotion and role, it's in Thor Ragnarok that Tom Hiddleston takes a back seat and Loki shines. He starts as a sort of comic book starter villain, crashes into the emotional arc, smooth talks his way amongst the elite, joins an escaping slave ship, and finally gets the glory and spotlight that he seems to have always just been seeking. He's not a hero, he's not a villain, he's not the crux of the emotional narrative or an uninspired fashy boy bragging on the success of previous arcs for sympathy. Loki in this film is something unique, something comic booky. Part 3. A Love Letter to Jack Kirby. It would be a huge disservice to both the film and the team behind it to discuss Thor Ragnarok without discussing Jack Kirby. Born Jacob Kurtzberg on August 28, 1917, Jack the King Kirby is one of the most innovative, talented, and influential artists in the history of comics. The Jack Kirby Awards and Jack Kirby Hall of Fame were both named in his honour, as is the entire genre of Kirby-esque art and techniques such as the Kirby Crackle and Kirby Vision. He was involved in Captain America, Fantastic Four, Ant-Man, Incredible Hulk, The Mighty Thor, X-Men, Avengers, Iron Man, Black Panther, The Inhumans, 2001: A Space Odyssey, Devil Dinosaur, Silver Surfer, all just whilst working for Marvel. He was known for his dynamic, bombastic, and inventive style, his impact on narrative, and his 90 people's worth of kick-ass packed into one neat little artist frame. Kirby served as a scout during the Second World War, putting his art stills to use in the field, having already completed all his comics for the entire length of his service. Apocryphal anecdotes describe him rolling up his sleeves and heading down to the office for a punch-up when local Nazis didn't like his work in Captain America, and responding to requests to include more white people in Black Panther by introducing the KKK as villains. For all the recognition that goes to Stan Lee, Kirby was a revolutionary figure in creators' rights, inclusive comics, graphic narrative, 20th century art, and the cosmology of the Marvel Universe, and in my eyes he's the undisputed king of modern comics. Kirby was known for the intricate, brightly coloured imagery of his interstellar art, and especially his famous collage pages, where he used cutouts from science magazines and covers to create stunning splash pages portraying the majesty of space. He drew influence from pop art, cubism, modernism, primitivism, and outsider art. He used dynamic posing and levels of focus to draw the reader's eye. It's Kirby's vision, his artistry, his conception of the universe, which we see splashed across every frame of Thor Ragnarok. And finally, someone with an obvious love for the artistry of comics has been allowed to fix the MCU's mediocre at best colour grading. Whitey has admitted to being a long-term fan in several interviews, and he spins the modern majesty of an epic superhero film together with a Kirby-esque space opera to pull out one of the most aesthetically stunning films the MCU has ever produced. The colour palette is pure 60s pop, the costumes are Silver Age at its finest, the filming and effects are top of the modern range. If Stan Lee is coming to the end of his reign, maybe it's time we started to recognise just how good these films can look when we take inspiration from the founding artists of comic books. Thor Ragnarok was filmed on sets as often as possible, using simple dual-colour backgrounds and lit with inserted LEDs to reflect Kirby's two-dimensional prismatic style. The production and design team used hugely dominant colour schemes to reflect the simplicity of early comic art. They drew heavy contrasts, like the complete lack of gold in Sakaar to distinguish it from the shining spires of Asgard. Strings of single-colour frames come together to create a polychromatic whole. The perspectives on this film are smaller than previous, with Asgard a much shorter city than previous visits, and Sakaar's exteriors are rarely seen from anything but flat angles, mimicking Kirby's focus on the action points in his frames. It isn't that this film looks like a Jack Kirby panel, some scenes do from time to time, but the inspiration is not in the actual appearance of the film, but in the construction of its world and its people. A good example is the costume design on Asgard, which brings this new style into the established movies, ending with Thor's freshly iconic looks without betraying the origins of the film. Astronaut and mix-and-match time period aesthetics. Kirby favoured his alien stylings without making it alienating to the audience by looking like something out of a very early episode of Doctor Who. The influences from Kirby, and specifically the 1960s work of Kirby on Marvel's cosmic storylines, is used to create a grounded, otherworldly, and stunningly beautiful film. So if the characters are good, the style is gorgeous, what's letting this movie down? Why isn't it the best movie Marvel have ever made? There's a couple of good answers, including liking things is super subjective, and it's not Thor Ragnarok's fault if the other MCU movies are just as good. But I think the obvious question that comes up is, does the plot let Thor Ragnarok down? Is it a kitschy, well-stylized space opera that's just not grand enough for a modern cinema audience? Part 4. So, why is colonialism in the title of this video anyway? Thor Ragnarok is a movie about how the only thing that can unite two siblings is coming together against a third, older sibling. No, obviously not. Thor Ragnarok is a movie about the end of Asgard. Still not right. Thor Ragnarok is a movie about fun times in space and badass good guys doing cool stuff. Okay, I'll stop. Thor Ragnarok is a movie about coming to terms with colonialism, exploitation, and the bloody history of your own nation. No, really. If you're not a huge fan of Marvel movie reviews, meta-analyses, and also you're not super into thinking about colonialism while you're sitting in the cinema, it might be news to you that Ragnarok even has a theme. But yeah, I'm about to explain to you how this movie confronts colonialism. In this movie, Thor discovers that his culture, his people, his nation, his own father were a force of vast suffering and subjugation across the galaxy. After the death of Odin, he meets his sister, Hela, once the conquering supreme warrior of Asgard's forces, who destroys the icon of his power effortlessly, revealing his weak footing in the world for what it always was. She returns to Asgard and peels away its pretensions of moral superiority and historic benevolence, revealing its buried secrets and bloody relics cast aside. Meanwhile, Thor finds himself a slave on Sakaar, cast out of his power once again, but this time without allies, without promise of the future, without even his freedom. He escapes, triggering a revolt, returns to Asgard, and defeats Hela by accepting his legacy and destroying his world, leading his people as refugees into the void of space. Thor Ragnarok confronts a simple truth that a culture does not simply become an icon of wealth, peace, wisdom, and prosperity without conquest. Hela's presence tears up Asgard for its self-promoting lies, and revels in it for what it is, a race of gods, of warriors, of conquerors. The Asgard she arrives at, like Thor, is blindsided by this blood-stained past, because of Odin's deceit. Odin promoted Asgard, was proud of her wealth and beauty, but was shamed by how she came by it, under his hand. And so we come to Thor on Sakaar, suddenly the member of the inferior race, impotent and enslaved. Loki offers him an alternative to returning. He could forget what he's learned, leave Asgard and her bloodied treasures to Hela, take his own life out of the shadow of his father's sins. And of course, Thor does not. And ultimately this is the moral thread of Thor Ragnarok. As a white British person, whose closest contact with the sharp end of the colonialism stick is a granny who wouldn't let us speak Welsh at home, this is where Thor begins to represent me. To represent you, the audience, as members of any historically powerful group, as consumers of a dominant culture that became dominant the only way cultures can become dominant. It tells you to take steps to reconcile that brutal history with the modern world. Often Hollywood takes a simplistic view of race that focuses on flawed individuals, which implies that Thor would have been right to stay on Sakaar. A lot of films seem to think that being a good person in this light is just not taking an active role in the oppression of others. Thor just needs to not massacre any frost giants, exactly the moral he learned in the first movie, by that standard, and it works, because Thor isn't a bad guy, he is just a naive beneficiary of this legacy. But Thor Ragnarok says, no, not good enough. Yes, there's the plight of Thor's people to worry about, but even when he rescues them, he still has to tear his world up from its roots. That's the only way to reconcile with the brutal history of his race, and he does so magnificently. Thor in this film avows himself utterly of the view that Asgard is a people, not a place, and he opens those people up to accept others, and sets course for Earth. Contrast Scourge, someone who disengages, who goes along with atrocity for the easy path and then can go no further. The avatar of the apathetic, he's vile and cowardly, a comic secondary villain whose final sacrifice is barely a passing note in the vast battle on the Bifrost. Hela and the Grandmaster, as villains, fit into the theme too. They represent these two opposing faces of oppression, the destroyer and the charmer, the stick and the carrot, the cruel and the kind. Obey me or suffer, says Hela, but the Grandmaster says, you wouldn't want to disobey me anyway. Hilla's cruelty is obvious, and yet there's a sympathy for her, the relic cast aside by a culture pretending it's something it never was. The Grand Master is a different matter entirely, with his talk of love, his euphemisms for the dirty side of his empire, his affectionate smiles and goofiness. The message is pretty clear. It's the same evil. One isn't better than the other. It's honesty and lies. You're not a horrifying, cruel ruler of a vicious empire just because you wear a cool robe and are kind of charming. Thor Ragnarok is the franchise's first outing by a director of colour, one of very few non-American directors, and he brings this unique perspective to the moral, and finally brings characters of colour to key positions within the theme of the story. Heimdall gets his most majestic outing yet, and he's the all-seeing who has seen enough. He steps up to protect his people when their own force of subjugation turns upon them. More potent still, we meet Valkyrie, a war-torn veteran hidden on Sakaar after Hela's defeat, a tool of this new oppressive system even as she has cast off the previous one. She's an active participant in the Grandmaster's slave trade, a traumatised, apathetic drunk, until the appearance of two Asgardians in her life brings her past back to throw her actions in her face. With the support of her fellows, Valkyrie strides out onto the bridge and defends the soul of her people, the only thing that matters. And yet Valkyrie represents both oppressor and oppressed, staying in her self-imposed exile because she's misunderstood by the Asgardians she does meet, because her struggles have been erased from her nation's own history books. It isn't enough to just disengage from your own history. You have to confront it, to reduce your culture to its people in the kiln of a purifying flame. This is the central premise of Thor Ragnarok, and it's so subtle, so careful, so intricately threaded through the synthy poppy composition of this electric space opera, you barely even saw it coming, unless you did. Because part of the reason that this has only really been brought up by more alternative reviewers is because this is something that you don't notice unless it's obvious to you, unless it's something that impacts you. Like I said, I'm a white British person, and I consider myself fairly competent in understanding movies. I'm good on my comic books, I'm good on my mythology stuff. I didn't pick up on the moral until it was pointed out to me by reviewers from other backgrounds. I benefit massively from colonialism, so while I sort of vaguely saw there was a theme there, I didn't pick up on how deeply layered it was until someone wrote about it and I read it. So that's why I'm going to end this with a list of some alternative reading from people who, unlike me, actually have a position to talk about this kind of thing. On that note, I've been Ginny Greenteeth. This has been Myths, Comics and Colonialism, Approaches to Thor Ragnarok. Thank you for watching.